Welcome to this presentation on strategies to improve the quality of teaching and learning. The issue of quality is one of the two issues that we have identified as major challenges on which Module 4 will work. In this presentation, we will start with an analysis of two major research studies on quality, one focusing more on quality at the school level, and a second one more on the overall system level quality. We will discuss what are the implications of this research for strategies, and we will end with some summary conclusions about quality improvement strategies, what to do and what to avoid. We know that there are many different studies, there is much research on quality improvement. Since decades, quality improvement is a major theme in many different countries, both developed and developing, the South and the North, and many of these studies have arrived at somewhat different conclusions. This is in part because of the distinction between research that is more quantitative, that tends to look at a wide range of students or a wide range of schools, applies a test, for instance, on what students have learned, and then try to distinguish in the different factors that have an impact on test results. This is the typical quantitative research. Or qualitative research, which in many cases looks only at a few exceptional cases or a few typical cases, 4, 5, 6 schools, 2 districts, maybe one region, or such a very much focused research, and that goes into much more depth through interviews, through discussions, and indeed answers more the questions of why certain things happen and what happens. So we can make a distinction between quantitative and qualitative research. We can also make a distinction between research that focuses more on specific schools and research that looks more at the system as a whole. It is difficult when faced with such a wide diversity of research products to select those that are worth examining in detail. And our selection is not necessarily very well argued, but we have taken two examples of research in part because both of these examples combine quantitative and qualitative methods, and because they at the same time have really quite a different focus. The first one that we will look at looks at schools and how schools improve. The second one looks at systems, education systems, and how education systems improve. At the same time, we have provided you with much required reading that summarizes also some of the more recent research on education quality. This being said, there is relatively little progress over the last 2 or 3 decades in what we know about quality. Much of what we know now is fairly similar to what we knew 2 or 3 decades ago. So much of what we will present here in this particular presentation, which focuses on research studies that are not very, very recent, much of this is still relevant. As I said, we will make a distinction between what we would call school improvement studies and system improvement studies. We will start with an example of what is a form of school improvement study. This example comes from research that was undertaken already close to 25, 30 years ago on the functioning of schools in different contexts, and that combined both qualitative and quantitative elements. The quantitative elements consisted of assessment tests for students on various subjects. The qualitative elements were more discussions with teachers, discussions with head teachers, with parents of the students, with the administrators, and so on. This broad study was presented in a publication by Gabriel Caron and Tanyok Shaw called the quality of primary schools in different development contexts. You can find it on the internet, or we will also make it available in the optional reading. And how was this study constructed? Well, in 4 countries the work was undertaken: Guinea, China, in one particular province of China, a province of Mexico, and a province of India, Madhya Pradesh. In each of these countries or regions, about 40 to 50 schools were chosen, but these schools were chosen based in 5 very different zones in terms of development. From the least developed zone, sometimes called the marginal zone, to the most developed zone, the capital city usually. And there are important differences between these zones in terms of development, in terms of availability of social services, in terms even of the literacy rate of the parents and so on. In each of these zones, the authors examined some 10 to 12 schools, and these schools are quite similar within the zone. The purpose was to see to a large extent what the impact was of the environment as compared to the impact of factors that the school could control. Therefore, the 5 environments were very different, 5 different zones in terms of development, but the schools themselves within these zones were quite similar in terms of resources that were made available to these schools. And what we will do now is to present you some results of these findings in order to get a better idea of what explains the difference in quality between these schools. So we start from the question, do schools really make a difference? And I ask you to look at the following graph, which presents the results of a study on the Indian province of Madhya Pradesh. The graph, which is not very well presented, my apologies therefore, shows the results in the language, the main language spoken in India, Hindi, by each of these zones. As I mentioned, the study identified 5 different zones. The urban zone, quite well developed, with low levels of poverty, quite high levels of literacy, and so on. The semi-urban zone, the developed rural zone, which is rural and therefore has less access to public services, but is quite developed, the marginal rural zone, and finally the indigenous rural zone, which to a large extent had very little access to public services, and where the poverty rates were very high. And we have here grouped the results of all the students in these 5 zones who participated in the assessment tests, and we've made a distinction between those who master Hindi, which is in the very white color, those who have partial mastery of Hindi, and those who have no mastery of Hindi in the gray color. And my question to you is, what can be the first conclusion that you can draw? What can be the first conclusion that you can draw? Think about that for a moment. Well, it is quite evident from the research findings that were just presented. When I ask you, do schools make a difference? Your argument probably will be no. What makes the difference here is the environment. We have seen that if you are in the urban zone, you learn much, much more than if you are in the most remote, the indigenous zone. And we see almost a systematic difference. The further away you are from the developed zone, the less quality is achieved within schools, and the environment, therefore, is the determining factor of school results. That seems to be the case. The poorer the more challenging the environment, the less impressive are the learning results. Indeed, suppose that you are a principal and I am the supervisor, and I come to your school and I ask you as a principal, come to your school, for instance, in the marginal rural zone, where the results are so weak. I ask you to explain why the results are so weak. What would be your answer? Think about that for a moment. Your answer would probably be to the inspector, sir or madam, I cannot really help it. As a principal, I cannot help that the results are so weak because of the environment within which my school is situated. There are very few public services, there is little support, and so on and so forth. We will take a look now at the second graph. This second graph has the same research results, but now the results are presented by school within each zone. In the first graph, we had grouped all the schools within the zone. Now we are going within that zone, show the results by school. This is the graph that you can see, and it shows results for two subjects, mathematics in white, Hindi in gray. It shows the average mark per school for grade 5 students. And as you can see, in each zone there are 10 to 12 schools, and each column, each bar that you see there shows you the results on average in grade 5 of that school for mathematics and Hindi. In the urban zone, with some schools doing very well, an average mark of 80 for mathematics, 90 for Hindi. That's the first school that you see the most to the left. But within the same zone, some schools are doing weak, and so on. And now again, my question to you is, what conclusion can you draw? Imagine that you are the principal of a school in the marginal rural area where your results are really quite weak. The same principal that responded earlier to the inspector that the results are weak, sir or madam, because my school is based in the marginal rural area, few public services, poverty rates high, and so on. And suppose that you are again the principal of that school, or rather, you are now the inspector, and this is the response that you have received from the principal. The results are weak for my school because I am in the marginal rural area. When you see this graph, how would you respond as an inspector to that principal? Well, if I were the inspector, my response would be, but principal, within the same zone, very close by here, we have other schools that are doing actually really very well. Schools where the results are much better than your school. Because indeed in the marginal rural area, as you can see, we have some schools that are doing better than even schools in the semi-urban or many schools in the urban area. We have a school that scores close to 75 to 80% as an average mark. And of course, we have some schools that are doing very bad also. But so the result, the conclusion, therefore, would be that no, the environment is not necessarily the most decisive factor, because within the same environment, we have schools with very different results. This more detailed analysis shows indeed that there are significant differences between schools within the same zone, and therefore we can conclude that even within the same environment, schools can and do make a difference, and some schools can overcome the challenges that the environment presents. This brings us now to a third question. Namely, what are the factors that make a difference between schools? The following graph is a graph that I usually hesitate to show because it could lead to wrong conclusions, but that at the same time is the result of research and is a useful graph to discuss. It shows and compares the results of government schools and privately run schools in Madhya Pradesh, in the city, the capital city of Madhya Pradesh. And of course, we have to be careful here that what we are saying here about government-run and privately run schools is specific to Madhya Pradesh. I'll come back to that. But it is a graph that we can learn something from. Keep in mind that the conditions in terms of resources of these different schools were quite similar. So it is not as if in this case the private schools were so much better off, had more resources, better paid teachers and so on. No, to a large extent, conditions in terms of resources were quite similar. Nevertheless, the results are very different. You see here on the left of the graph, the first 12 to 15 bars are the private schools, and then we have 8 government-run schools in the city of Indore and the suburb of Gwalior. What we see here is quite striking. The private schools, almost all of them, are doing better than the government schools. And I certainly do not want us to conclude, certainly not that we should privatize public education. I am fully against that. What is the question here is, why that difference? What are the factors that seem to explain why privately run schools function better than public schools, even if they have similar resources? And again, it's a question to you. What do you think from your own experience, maybe? Why in some cases privately run schools run better than public schools? This being said, in many other countries, public schools run better than private schools for the same reasons as here in India, private schools run better than public schools. I'll come back to that. But what could you think could be the differences? Why in this particular context, or why in a number of other contexts that we may know, privately run schools sometimes have access to strategies that maybe public schools do not have? In the particular case of Madhya Pradesh, the differences between these two types of schools were related mainly to two differences which are what we have earlier called process related. Firstly, in the privately run schools, there is closer supervision and support by the head teacher principal than in the public schools. And this may be the case in a number of systems, though not everywhere. On a personal note, I started my career, as some of you know by now, as a teacher in Grenada. 3 years I was a secondary school teacher, and I was working with a very, very effective head teacher, a very effective principal, who exercised indeed very close supervision and support, and it was certainly a public school, very much so. So it is not the fact that the school is public or private, it is the fact that the principal of the school takes the initiative to closely supervise and support teachers, regularly working together with heads of department or regularly working together with senior teachers or deputy principal, depending on the type of school, the size of school, and so on. That's the first major difference that explains in this particular case the difference in learning between students in the private schools and in the public schools. And the second difference was that indeed there was a closer relationship between the school and the community of parents. with the parents to a large extent demanding more accountability from the private schools, demanding more performance from the private schools, but also willing to support the schools, willing to support the teachers, willing to support the children, their own children, more. Here again, this is not something that is unique to a private school. It can easily be introduced within the public school network, but it is an important factor. So what we see here is that the factors that explain the improvement are mainly related to process factors. So what are some of the conclusions we can draw from that? Firstly, the links between inputs and results are neither direct nor linear. We know that already, but it is good nevertheless to emphasize it again, that it is not because we put more inputs into a school that automatically this will lead to better learning. It is not a direct relationship, neither is it a linear relationship. We have schools that have to a large extent the same set of inputs and nevertheless they achieve different results, and that is because these process factors play such a key role. And indeed, quality improvement depends very much on what happens at the school level, on the management of the school. What do we mean with process factors? Process factors in this case can be understood as a series of relationships within the school, between the principal, teachers, students, between the school and its surrounding community, and between the school and the administration, in many cases the school and the pedagogical supervisors, the pedagogical advisors, the inspectors, the education officers, the curriculum officers, and so on. At the same, so that's some of the main conclusions, but I'll come back to these conclusions towards the end of this presentation. One difficulty with such research as the one that I have just presented is that this is research that looks at, in many cases, a few exceptional schools, a few specific cases, and it is not always that evident to draw lessons from such cases. And in particular, it is difficult to turn what is specific practice into system-wide practice. It is much easier to change one school than to change a system. And it is not because a particular strategy works well in one school that it automatically works in all schools. And we cannot expect either that all our principals will be exceptional individuals with great commitment and strong management skills. We cannot expect that all of our supervisory officers will be fully dedicated to improving the quality of the education system, and will be able to respond to the needs of each school in a flexible and in strategic manner. So that question remains a very important one. A third limit to some extent to school improvement research is that it is difficult also to make this politically palatable, politically tasty, politically useful. We know that in many cases decision makers are attracted by quick solutions, by what tends to be called a silver bullet. There's one issue that will improve immediately our education system. And the response to a large extent is that does not exist. Some strategies work better than others, undoubtedly. Even then, their effectiveness depends on the context. But in many cases, we cannot say that this single strategy will be successful. So that's some of the results, some of the findings from our first research study that we've examined, looking at the quality of schools in different development contexts. In the next part of this presentation, we will look at the system improvement study that was produced some 10 years ago by McKinsey.